Welcome back everybody, this is GDS. Before we start this video, I want you to go to the blah blah below, that's the comments, and let me know about a time that you ran a game and blended genres. What did you try to achieve, and how did your players react? This is a small channel, I don't get many comments, so if you comment below I'm going to see it, heart it, and very likely respond, so let's get a conversation going. Also, if you like conversations about the kind of stuff we talk about on this channel, make sure to check out the link to the Discord, which is going to be in the nonsense below. Ours is a small community, so come join our conversation. So why might you want to blend genres when you run the game? When you blend genres, you can try out different kinds of ways of running the game without necessarily committing to running that for an entire campaign. When you blend genres, you can also express or explore ideas in your game that are better served by the genre you want to blend than the default genre of the game you're running. For example, if you run a regular D&D fantasy-style whimsical campaign, but you want to focus on a murder mystery that happens as part of your plot, you might want to use the detective-style genre for a session or two, or however long the players take to get through that chunk of content. The reason for that is that the goals that you have when you do something like a murder mystery better align with the goals and fantasies that are fulfilled by the detective genre than the D&D fantasy genre. One other reason you might want to blend genres is that as you play the same kind of game and the same genre of game, players might start getting sensitized to the kinds of things that might pop up. For example, if you run a sci-fi game, the first time they see a sci-fi thing, they might get excited, and they might love it the second and third time, but after 100 times of sci-fi things, players might get sensitized to seeing cool sci-fi things, no matter how cool they are. Having a switch of genres doesn't only let you explore different genres that the players are not sensitized to, it also desensitizes your players to the kind of game you typically run. So when you go back to playing sci-fi or playing fantasy, players are excited by it again. The final reason I have to blend genres, which I think should not be overlooked, is that so many cool pieces of media blend genres. For example, I have here behind me all these wonderful books and some of these board games that blend genres beautifully. If you want to try to imitate those board games or books, or at least try to do parts of what they're doing, you're going to have to blend genres. So why is blending genres something I need to make a video about? What's the difficulty with blending genres? The difficulty is that different genres have different fantasies and therefore different goals that they try to fulfill. Which means that when you try to blend different genres, for example, a slow cook mystery and an action movie genre, those things eventually come into conflict, because in some cases there is discordance between the fantasies that they're trying to fulfill. Does this difficulty mean that you should only pick genres that don't contradict each other? The answer to that is actually no. One easy justification for that is that the games we run have contradicting goals already. For example, we want our game to be simple or easy to follow, but we also want it to be interesting, which adds complexity. Having more facets makes a game less simple, and yet we can still have the goal of making something as simple as it can be while also making it interesting. The games we run already have contradictions within them, and that's why running a game and blending genres is not a solved problem. It's a constant dance of optimization. Since goals are not independent dimensions, different configurations of mechanics can fulfill them in different ways. For example, let's say we run a game that we want to be political, we want it to have tactical combat, and we don't want it to have more complexity than it needs to have, so we want it to be simple. If running a game was a solved problem, then we would just turn those three things up to 100 and call it a day. But those three dials, those three goals, are not independent. When you change one, you end up also changing the other. For example, any mechanic that you add to combat to make it feel more gritty or more realistic is going to end up making the game less simple. And any space on the sheet that is taken by political information is space that could be taken by tactical information. All of this is to say that when you determine the genres you want to mix, their goals can contradict. That's totally fine. The key is going to be to find overlap, and that's going to be our next section. There are two keys to blending genres. The first one is overlap, and the second one is tropes. Let's talk about it. While different genres certainly have their contradictions, they also have overlaps. When you blend two genres, the overlaps are going to be the parts of your game that you sustain as you transition from one genre to another. Anything that doesn't overlap is a contradiction. And as you transition from one genre to another, you want to go to your contradiction levers, and you want to turn up the things that contradict the genre you're transitioning from, and turn down the contradictions to the genre you're transitioning to. A quick example is if you're running a cyberpunk game and you want to go from cyberpunk to cosmic horror, you might start with a neon-drenched landscape and slowly introduce creeping paranoia and unknowable horrors, turning down high-tech action and turning up existential dread. I'll have some full examples for you after I go over the second part of blending genres, which is tropes. An important part of almost all genres is distinct tropes. Things that happen within that genre that characterize it. What you want to do with this key is to use tropes from one genre to fulfill the fantasy of the other genre. Let me give you a few examples. If you're running a comedy zombie game, you might want to use the trope of zombies being slow and clumsy to create funny moments. Or, and I'm going to read off my notes because I think this is maybe a cool idea, if you're running a sci-fi murder mystery session, you can use the "to catch a killer, you need to think like a killer" trope by questioning an AI that was trained on a suspect's notes and recorded conversations. Again, the main idea here is to take trope from one genre and fulfill the fantasy of the other genre using that trope. So this is how you blend genres. The first thing you do is you determine what are the contradictions and what are the overlaps. The overlaps are going to stay. The contradictions we're going to turn up or down depending on which genre we want to be in at the moment. The second thing is tropes. The tropes are the things that make the genres recognizable as such. We want to intermix them such that we use the tropes from one genre to fulfill fantasies from another genre. Let's go through two examples. The first one, which I think many people have tried to do, and have done successfully too, is to mix D&D style fantasy and horror. What are some fantasy and goals of horrors? I would say scary monsters, definitely. Another thing I would say is the potential of death. You notice that in many horror films and games, there is always the potential of whatever is chasing you or whatever the danger is actually being dangerous and killing the protagonist. And then horror is, of course, well known for having suspense and dark themes. Now let's think about some things that D&D fantasy does. I would say fighting monsters is definitely one of them. We also have, pulp fantasy nonsense like the ranger and the rogue and the bard and stuff like that. And I would also say that in D&D fantasy, the heroes are, well, they're heroes. They're heroic and they do heroic things. They fight bad guys and they generally don't die to low-level goons. So what are the commonalities between horror and D&D? I think one of them is definitely monsters, that's an obvious one. And the second one is dungeons, because D&D has dungeons, and dungeons are dark and spooky, or at least they can be. What are some contradictions? I think there are two main ones. The first one is that, well, D&D is supposed to be heroic, and the heroes are not really expected to die in a given adventure. Horror has an expectation of potential death. And then the second major contradiction is that the atmosphere of horror is darkness and suspense, and then in D&D, it's more pulp fantasy whimsy. So if you want to blend these two genres, the first thing to do is actually, before the session, tell the players that the next session is going to contain some horror elements, and make sure you have that buy-in from the players. You're going to tell them that they might not necessarily be able to fight the monsters when the session turns horror-esque. The reason you want to do that is you want to set the expectations and avoid player frustration. Players expect to play heroes, but you want them to run away and hide. Communicate what you want to do before the session to avoid frustration and make sure everyone can actually enjoy what's happening. Then you can plan your session and you can make it so it's a regular D&D session. Maybe you can foreshadow some dark elements, and then as soon as you arrive at the dungeon, things can start shifting towards horror. You can start describing things in a darker tone. You can have a particular monster that maybe chases them through the dungeon and, have visceral descriptions and stuff like that. and you can have them go through the dungeon and get what they need while being haunted the entire time. So in this case, as we transition from D&D style genre to horror, we remove the ability to fight things and we make death possible. We start making things scary, and we start making things a lot less about the character sheets, because those are about D&D. They are D&D character sheets about fighting monsters. That's not what it's about. It's going to be a lot more about describing the scene and asking the players what they do. If we want to add some tropes, we can also use the pulp fantasy chosen one trope with a symbiotic possession trope by having maybe an important NPC that is the chosen one for a particular cause, but their power or their chosenness comes from being possessed and slowly taken over by a malevolent creature. That's just one example of blending D&D with horror. I wanted to do one really hard example to really stretch the extent of my advice and see that it is actually useful. So let's try to blend Western with fairy tales. I wrote some commonalities between the two. I would say good versus evil themes are definitely common. You have larger than life characters. Usually, both things happen in a rural or a remote setting. You have heavy use of archetypes when it comes to characters, and you have conflicts with authority. Now, some obvious contradictions between these two things is that, well, fairy tales are whimsical and westerns are gritty. Fairy tales are magical and westerns tend to be realistic. So when we run this game and blend these two genres, we can just run our western game regularly and have players follow a particular plot thread from the frontier town that goes to a secluded area of wilderness and weird magic and rumors. Maybe in your game, because it's a western, part of it is survival and players have to keep track of supplies and food. Only when they get to our whimsical fantasy fairy tale area, they don't have to do that anymore because we're going to turn down that realism contradiction. As players navigate this area, they can be caught up in a fairy tale style subplot of good versus evil, meeting larger than life characters, NPCs, and fighting for a happy ending. Happy endings are not common in westerns, at least I don't think, but they definitely are in fairy tales. We can also include some elements from folk mythology or whatever we think is cool and evocative of both of these genres. Maybe we can use the fairy tale archetype of the evil king to fulfill the Western fantasy of some authority to resist. Maybe the evil king realizes that the player characters don't belong in the fairy tale area and sends after them a bounty hunter man with no name. Another possibility is taking the trope of the Robin Hood character, taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor, and turning it into a Western bank heist. The possibilities of genre blending are limitless, and I hope from these examples you can see how I think the harder two genres are to put together, the better the result is when you actually manage to do it. That's everything I have to say on blending genres. I hope you end up doing it in your game, and if you do, please let me know how it went, either in the blah blah below, that's the comments, or in the Discord, which I hope you join. If you're not subscribed, make sure to absolutely smash the subscribe button with all your might. Let's do an odd number of clicks. Let's go for 17, a nice prime number. And make sure to like the video. If you liked it, I need you to smash it physically, by the way. If you have a monitor, just smash your head into it. If you have a phone, there's a variety of objects you can smash it with. You can use glass, you can use a mug, you can use whatever it is you want. Just make sure you like an odd number of times. By the way, if you're already subscribed, only click the subscribe button for an even number of times. This gets complicated. Oh, there's a bell. Hit the bell, get notifications. I hear that helps. I can't tell you how much this stuff helps because honestly, I don't know. I don't know how the algorithm works, but I'm sure it does something. That's everything I have for today. I'll see you later.